They called it the City of Echoes, a place that thrived with noise, markets shouting, bells ringing, children laughing through narrow stone streets. Then, in a single night, everything stopped. When dawn came, not a voice remained. Soldiers arrived to find gates wide open, meals half-eaten, cups still warm with wine. Horses stood saddled, but no riders ever returned. Merchants' scales lay tipped with coins still balanced, candles still burned in bedrooms, water still poured from fountains. It was as if thousands of souls had stood up mid-breath and vanished. No screams, no blood, no signs of struggle. An entire city erased itself, leaving only silence. Witnesses swore they felt watched as they walked through the empty streets, as though unseen eyes followed their every step. And at the city's heart, a single door was found locked from the inside, scratched, clawed, and marked by hands that should not have been alone. What force can strip a city of its people overnight, without a trace, without a sound? They called the mystery the Silence of Aramor. Chroniclers of the age wrote of it with shaking hands, reluctant to ink words that might summon back whatever had happened there. The city was not small. Records suggest 10,000 souls lived within its walls. Artisans, masons, scribes, children, guards. To vanish all at once defied every known calamity. No plague moves with such precision. No army kills without bodies. No fire leaves bread warm upon the table. Aramor had been a jewel of trade, its stone bridges and vaulted halls the pride of the kingdom. Merchants from far provinces gathered in its markets. Monks copied manuscripts in its cloisters. Then, without warning, everything ended. Scouts who entered days later described dogs roaming, collars still around their necks, whining at doors that would never open again. They said looms still clattered in empty workshops, threads tangled mid-pattern, as though unseen hands still worked. The silence was worse than screams. Entire streets echoed with the clink of wind against abandoned shutters. Rumors spread quickly. Some claimed a cursed bell had tolled at midnight, audible only to the city's residents, summoning them into the earth. Others spoke of a shadow that rolled across the streets like smoke, swallowing voices. Fishermen swore they saw torches moving on the city's walls the night it happened. Yet when they rode closer, the lights winked out and no guards were found. The king dispatched scribes and investigators, demanding answers. They searched for tunnels, pits, even traces of mass flight. Yet no footprints led away from the gates. No wagon tracks carved the roads. Everything suggested the people had not left. They had simply ceased. One chronicle tells of a chapel in the northern quarter. Its pews were filled, but every robe, every boot, every ring of gold still lay upon the benches, as though flesh itself had been peeled away, leaving clothes and possessions untouched. But no bones, no ash, only emptiness. Priests declared it divine punishment, a holy cleansing, the kind whispered of in ancient scripture. But others, more quietly, spoke of old legends buried in the land long before the city was built. Legends of voices beneath the stone, legends of bargains made in silence. The most unsettling account came from a young squire who returned from the ruins days later, pale and broken. He claimed he heard whispers chasing him through the streets, not in one tongue, but in many, languages he did not know, all calling his name. He swore shadows moved against the walls, not cast by torch or moonlight, but shifting of their own accord. When pressed, he collapsed into trembling silence and never spoke again. And so Aramor became a forbidden place. Maps marked it, but travelers skirted wide around it. The city stood untouched for decades, its stone walls crumbling, its towers collapsing into dust. No one dared claim its treasures. No king annexed its land. It was as though the silence itself guarded the ruins. Nearby villages told tales to children. Never whistle at night, lest the silence come. Never fall asleep with your mouth open, lest your breath be stolen. Merchants refused to camp within sight of its towers, convinced that dreams turned to ash in its shadow. But in hidden archives among the margins of faded manuscripts, hints survived that the silence was not the first of its kind. Other towns, smaller, nameless, had been swallowed centuries before. Whole communities erased overnight, leaving only stories that frightened children around firelight. Scholars tried to impose reason. Some argued that toxic vapors might have seeped up from deep caverns, suffocating the people in their sleep. But this could not explain why livestock remained alive, why food stayed warm, why dogs howled but lived. Others suggested mass hysteria, a migration carried out in secret. Yet there were no signs of carts, no missing supplies from storehouses. Kings feared it was the work of an enemy wielding unknown power. Messengers carried frantic letters across kingdoms, warning rulers to watch their own cities at night. Guards doubled their watches. Bells were forbidden to toll after dark, and prayers grew desperate in cathedrals. But the silence did not strike again. Not then. It lingered only in rumor, in whispers that spread further with each passing year. If that is true, then Aramor was not an isolated tragedy. It was part of something larger, something old, something that waits. And the question that haunted every kingdom that heard its tale was this: if it happened once without warning, what stops it from happening again? In the decades after Aramor fell silent, a different search began, not in streets, but in margins. Merrick, a royal archivist who weighed errors like a mason weighs stones, unraveled a pattern no priest wanted read aloud. He dragged tax rolls onto tables, pried open guild ledgers, peeled seals from private letters. He wasn't hunting a culprit, he was hunting repetition. He charted dates, circled names, drew lines between places never meant to touch. 2 winters before Aramor, a marsh hamlet woke to empty beds. 30 years earlier, a stone village under a broken aqueduct vanished after midnight, sheep milling in their pens. Farther back, a frontier fort was found with armor stacked and dice midcast. Each tale alone was a ghost story, together a ledger. Merrick marked the first constant. In every place there had been a new bell, commissioned within a year of the vanishing, cast by the same traveling guild. They called themselves the Concordium of St. Ulrich. They paid an exact silver, took no local apprentices, and moved on. Their signet showed a hand with 3 missing fingers. Merrick asked for time, not soldiers, and rode the trade roads alone. In monasteries, he counted tones in marginal hymns and found complaints of bells that tolled too cleanly, resonance that hummed in bones. A monk wrote that a new bell carried not sound, but pause. At a ruined foundry in the hills, Merrick sifted slag until he uncovered a soot-scarred ledger, bound in boiled leather, clipped with a brass claw. It listed castings, town, weight, composition, tone, price, next to tone, a hollow circle crossed by a line. Every 10th entry bore a second mark, a slash, a harvest. Margin notes in a tight, ruthless hand spoke of tuning the void between tones, striking intervals that traveled through breath. Not a call to gather, a subtraction. Merrick carried the ledger to court. The king ordered it sealed. Priests demanded it burn. 3 nights later, the volume vanished from the royal vault. The last line in the log read, "Placed on the second shelf at vespers." By dawn, the shelf was bare. Merrick copied what he could from memory and returned to Aramor with a single guard and a mule stacked with tools. He was done with archives. He wanted the bell. They reached the central tower at noon. The belfry stairs had rotted, so Merrick climbed with iron spikes and rope. At the top, the bell hung gleaming, as if polished yesterday. Chalk dust refused its lip. The metal seemed to drink touch. On its waist lay the ledger's mark, a hollow circle slashed. Within, hairline etchings flared and vanished, depending on angle, scratches that would not hold still. He pressed his ear to the rim. No sound, only pressure. A pause shaped like a tone. He did not strike it. He tied a rope and lowered the bell. Halfway down the line, shivered as if something heavier than metal had landed on it. The guard whispered his name. The rope groaned, then held. They wrapped the bell and brought it to the plaza. The clapper wore a black, glassy film that a knife could not scar. Merrick chipped a grain from the inner lip. It drifted toward the clapper and vanished against it. The bell did not make sound. It collected it. He tested it. A clap. Nothing. A heel stamp. Nothing. He shouted the guard's name. The shout cut off mid-syllable, as if a hand had caught it. The guard's eyes watered. He swallowed a sound he could not spit out. The ledger had warned in a single, underlined sentence, "Never swing the clapper." Merrick touched it anyway, barely. The plaza did not ring, it thinned. Birds opened beaks and produced nothing. The mule stamped in silence. Merrick's breath halted halfway out and hung there, a locked door between ribs and air. He let the clapper fall away. Sound returned like pain. He bound the clapper in wool, ordered a sled, and dragged the bell out under night. On the road, pilgrims mistook it for a relic and left coin and bread. Merrick did not argue. He needed hands. They hauled the bell to a quarry where stonecutters had carved a pit as wide as a hall. He meant to drown it in crushed stone and lime, bury silence with weight. Before dawn, riders arrived with the king's seal. Orders: do not aid, do not hinder, only watch. Merrick set his jaw. "Lower it," he said. When the rim touched the pit, every hammer missed its next strike. Arms swung, blows landed. Impact died at birth. Men stared at their hands as if recalling how to be alive. "Lower it," Merrick repeated. The bell sank like a tooth back into a jaw. He shoveled lime until his shoulders failed. He looked up. 2 riders were gone from the ridge. No hoofprints led away. Their horses stood with reins dragging. The captain turned without a word and rode for the capital, leaving his men staring into a pit that refused to echo. Merrick wasn't finished. He ordered mortar mixed and poured, layered until the bell vanished beneath a pale lid. To test the seal, he dropped a chisel. It fell, struck stone, and the sound lived. Men breathed. A rope crew lowered a mason to smooth the surface. Halfway down, the rope slackened as if cut by nothing. The mason caught himself. His shout reached them in full. Merrick hauled him up anyway. He pressed a die into wet mortar and left a warning. "Do not dig, do not toll." To the captain's scribe, he said, "Send word that any Concordium bell be broken on sight." He gathered his notes, burned the rest, and walked away without looking back. Men who look back at pits keep walking toward them. Merrick's warning spread in whispers, copied by scribes with ink that trembled, carried by riders who rode at night without pause. Do not dig, do not toll, break every Concordium bell on sight. For a time it worked. Monasteries shattered their towers' bronze. Markets melted their bells into coins and tools. But fear has a half-life, and men forget. Decades passed. Merrick himself vanished from the record. No grave, no epitaph, only silence where his name should have been. His quarry pit filled with rain, hardened into stone, and children in nearby villages grew up skipping rocks over it, never knowing what lay beneath. Then came a new generation of rulers who craved order more than memory. They wanted bells again. Bells to mark the hours of labor. Bells to bind prayers to schedule. Bells to remind people of who held power over time itself. And so the Concordium returned, not openly, not under their old name, but in fragments, in traveling foundries whose masters bore the same signet, the hand with 3 missing fingers. They offered new castings, finer tones, bells said to soothe cattle, calm infants, and guard cities from fire. Kings signed their marks. Priests blessed the metal. One by one, bells rose again over spires and market squares. The first sign came in the border city of Harlow. Traders crossing at dusk saw torches still lit in its watchtowers. At dawn, the gates were ajar, and the city's horses screamed in their stables with no riders to claim them. Soldiers entered to find streets lined with boots, cloaks, and tools. Everything but the people themselves. But this time, something was different. Not all were gone. A handful staggered through the alleys, faces gray as ash, mouths opening and closing without words. They grasped at passers-by, desperate, but no sound left their throats. Their eyes begged, their lungs heaved, yet they lived in silence. One survivor, a mason's wife, managed to scrawl on a wall before her hands stiffened. It told thrice, and each time 1,000 voices thinned. Her words bled into the plaster until the chalk cracked in her fingers. She fell without a cry. This partial vanishing broke kingdoms more than total erasure. Now people knew the pattern had returned, and that it could strike while they still breathed. Merchants abandoned cities at the first rumor of a new bell. Markets collapsed, towers stood empty, and rulers tried to ban talk of it, calling it heresy. But silence cannot be outlawed. Priests declared the afflicted unclean, cursed with a punishment meant to warn. Yet in secret, some clergy began guarding the survivors, convinced they were marked, not damned. A sect grew in shadow, calling themselves the keepers of the pause. They believed the bells were not instruments of destruction, but vessels, containers for something older, something that fed on the subtraction of breath. Reports from the mountains told of keepers carrying fragments of broken bells wrapped in cloth, chanting in languages not their own. Villagers claimed their livestock fell mute for days after the keepers passed. No armies pursued them. Even the most zealous captains refused. They said swords felt blunt in their presence, as if steel itself dulled in silence. Meanwhile, kings clashed over the meaning. Some ordered every bell destroyed, throwing bronze into rivers. Others clung to them, arguing that fear itself gave the Concordium power, and that without obedience, no toll could harm. The realm divided between breakers and defenders. The bells tolled regardless. The most chilling account came from the second fall, the city of Calven. Unlike Aramor, its ending was witnessed. Merchants camping outside the gates saw the night unfold. They swore the first toll froze their torches mid-flame. Firelight held its shape but stopped moving, as if painted on air. The second toll made their words unravel. Men shouted, but their speech arrived twisted, syllables bent out of order, meaning lost before it left the mouth. By the third toll, the gates opened themselves and a wind rushed out with no sound, flattening tents and scattering beasts. When the merchants dared to enter, they found no citizens, only walls thrumming faintly, as if the stone itself remembered voices that were no longer there. A scribe among them wrote that the silence after Calven was not emptiness, but presence. He described it as being inside a lung that refused to exhale. He wrote 3 more pages before his ink bled sideways across the parchment, as if the letters resisted being written. He was found dead by morning, quill still in hand. Refugees from Calven carried the terror into every province. They brought nothing but shaking hands and broken voices. Some who had heard the tolls too closely lived on, but each night their lips moved in sleep, repeating words no one else could hear. They woke coughing dust, as if their lungs had been scraped hollow. Villages barred them at the gates, fearing contagion. Yet fear itself traveled faster than bodies. Attempts were made to destroy the bells outright. In one mountain town, men heated a Concordium bell until it glowed white. When they struck it with hammers, the blows landed without sound, sparks flared without crack, and when the metal cooled, it bore no mark. Another king ordered one hurled into the sea. Divers swore it tolled faintly under the waves, and fish washed ashore in silence for miles. An alchemist poured acid over fragments. The liquid hissed, but the stone floor beneath it burned while the bronze remained untouched. Scholars who studied the fragments paid with their lives. One tried to inscribe runes across a bell's lip. His hand moved, the chisel bit, but no sound marked stone or bronze. He finished the carving in silence and smiled grimly, certain he had succeeded. At dawn, he was found lifeless, lips pressed to the bell as if trying to breathe into it. Secret archives began to fill with these stories, locked away in monasteries that pretended to guard scripture. Scribes wrote of bells that tolled themselves in empty towers, swaying without wind. One night in a coastal abbey, monks woke to the bell above ringing not once but 7 times. In the morning, half the brothers were gone, their robes neatly folded on the stone floor. The others kept breathing, but every hymn they sang afterward faltered halfway, as if their voices remembered the silence and recoiled from it. Whispers spread that the Concordium was not a guild at all, but a sect older than kingdoms. They did not cast bells to serve men, but to keep covenant with something that existed before men spoke. A merchant swore he saw a bell founder burn his own hand in the molten pour without flinching, smiling as skin turned to ash. Another tale claimed the Concordium could speak without mouths moving, that their words arrived as thought, dry and cold. And yet, despite every horror, cities continued to commission bells. The sound of order was worth more than fear of silence. Rulers demanded control, Priests demanded ritual. Markets demanded time. The bells rose again, and with them, the certainty that another Aramor, another Calvin, was waiting. The terror was no longer the vanishing alone. It was the knowledge that the bells chose when to feed. They could toll a century after their casting, or the night they were raised. No guard could prevent it. No prayer could bind it. And those who lived through it whispered the worst truth of all. Once you had heard the pause inside a Concordium bell, you carried it with you, waiting for the moment it decided to finish the silence it had begun. Silence spread not only through fear, but through ambition. Some rulers began to wonder if the bells could be turned from curse to weapon. What greater power could a king possess than the ability to unmake a city with sound? The chronicles speak of Lord Vanar, a warlord whose banner was already soaked in fire and blood. When his scouts discovered a Concordium bell hidden in a monastery vault, he did not destroy it. He chained the monks, forced smiths to raise the bell in his fortress, and summoned his captains to witness its power. The priests begged him to bury it. His own advisors warned that every city struck before had been abandoned, not conquered. But Vanar saw opportunity. He believed that by mastering the toll, he could erase his enemies without sword or siege. At dawn, he ordered the bell tolled toward the rival city of Drevran, just 3 leagues away. Witnesses described the toll not as sound but as absence, an impact that bent the chest inward, a moment when lungs forgot what to do. From the fortress walls, soldiers watched the valley. Smoke rose from Drevran's hearths. Then, with the second toll, the smoke held still in the air like paint. The third toll carried no echo, yet its weight rolled across fields like a wave. When Vanar's men marched, they found gates unbarred, bread cooling on tables, wells still drawn, and every man, woman, and child gone. Victory left no plunder. There were no slaves, no spoils, no surrendered wealth, only silence. Vanar raged, striking captains who admitted the truth. A dead city feeds no empire. Yet worse followed. Within weeks, the silence seeped into his own fortress. Servants went missing. Horses stood bridleless, shuddering at night. Torches flickered without crackle. One by one, his men lost their voices in sleep, waking with mouths moving, but nothing inside. Soon the fortress itself was empty, its banners stiff in air that carried no cheer, no chant, no cry of war. Vanar's name became another warning. Those who use the toll do not wield it. They serve it. But ambition did not die with him. Other rulers tried in secret. Bells were smuggled on caravans, rolled in wagons under cloth, hidden beneath churches. Some believed that if a bell were tuned correctly, it could target only enemies, leaving their own untouched. They were wrong. Every attempt consumed friend and foe alike. One chronicle tells of a duke who struck his own bell at midnight to silence rebels in the countryside. By morning, not only the rebels, but half his capital were gone. The rest whispered, without sound, faces twisted in terror, unable to speak again. Within a year, the duke's line ended. Not from rebellion, but from the weight of his own court's silence. Meanwhile, the keepers of the pause grew bolder. They collected fragments, carried them across borders, and spread the doctrine that silence was the world's true inheritance. They claimed speech was a gift stolen from older gods, and the Concordium was merely restoring balance. Some towns welcomed them, desperate for answers, believing silence sacred. Others hounded them, burning their cloaks and relics. But even flames made little sound when keepers walked into them. Kings called councils, swore alliances, and issued decrees. But none could prevent what came next. The bells no longer needed Concordium hands to toll. In villages where bells had been raised and forgotten, the air itself began to move the clappers. Men woke at night to the hollow swing of bronze in windless towers. Women froze mid-song when the air cut off their notes, as if stolen to feed a distant toll. No longer were the bells bound by ropes and hands. They chose their own moments. They hungered on their own. And each time they did, the silence spread further, seeding terror deeper, until entire realms began to wonder not whether the bells would strike again, but which city would be the next to go dark overnight. The silence no longer belonged only to cities. It began to seep into the land itself. Travelers spoke of rivers that ran without sound, their currents foaming yet giving no murmur. In forests, birds beat their wings, but no rustle followed, and wolves opened their jaws in midnight howls that carried nothing. Storms raged without thunder. Trees split in lightning strikes, but no crack split the night. At first these were scattered tales. A miller who swore his wheel spun mute. A farmer who claimed his newborn lamb's mouth bleats without sound. But soon the tales overlapped, forming maps of silence that spread outward from every place a concordium bell had stood. These were not ruins anymore. They were zones, hollow places where the world's voice had been taken. Merchants rerouted caravans for fear of crossing them. Sailors claimed entire bays fell quiet, waves breaking against hulls without crash. They said a man could scream himself hoarse there and never disturb the gulls circling above. Priests declared these hollows cursed ground, but the keepers of the pause called them sacred. They walked barefoot into silent fields and laid their ears to the earth, claiming they could hear the world's first tongue buried beneath. Some villagers followed them, kneeling in mute procession. Others attacked them, but swords meeting bone rang without sound, and blood spilled without a cry. The attackers fled in terror, convinced silence itself would swallow them. The afflicted survivors from Harlow and Calviny were drawn to these hollows. They wandered there like moths to flame, their mouths opening and closing, repeating words no one could hear. The keepers took them in, declaring them living vessels of the pause. They dressed them in white cloth, paraded them in markets, and called them proof that silence was not death but a higher inheritance. Children were taught to place offerings of bread before them. Husbands whispered vows to them, hoping to be blessed. Kings tried to stamp out these rituals. They burned entire camps of keepers. Yet always the same report returned. The flames roared high, but men heard nothing until the fire died. Among the ashes, fragments of bronze were always found, never more than a thumb's size, etched with the hollow circle slashed. Scribes attempted to seal away the knowledge. Edicts forbade writing the concordium's name. Pages were torn from chronicles, sermons revised, maps redrawn. But silence has its own memory. Even when words were erased, the fear of them remained. Monks copying psalms sometimes found their ink bleeding into shapes they had not written. A circle, crossed by a single line. Others swore whole sentences vanished from parchment overnight, leaving gaps of empty vellum as though scripture itself had been eaten. The more kingdoms fought to suppress the story, the more it spread in rumor. In taverns, men swore they had seen bells toll without ropes, swinging in towers with clappers moving like pendulums of their own accord. Travelers swore some bells no longer needed towers. They simply appeared in fields, upright in soil as though they had grown from earth. Children dared each other to approach them, but those who touched the metal never laughed again. They lived, but their voices shrank to whispers no ear could catch. And still the hollows widened. Lakes froze without sound of cracking ice. Mines caved without echo of stone. A knight recounted how his company marched into a valley and heard their own armor clink, grow fainter with every step, until at last their footfalls made no mark at all. They returned shaking, convinced that, had they taken one step more, they would have walked into a silence that erased them. The bells no longer tolled to harvest. They no longer needed to. The world itself was beginning to hollow, and in the growing hush, a darker thought began to rise. That perhaps the bells were not bringing silence into the world. Perhaps they were waking the silence that had always been here, patient, waiting beneath every word ever spoken. And once awake, silence would not sleep again. Return to the first morning, gates open, bread warm, horses bridled, one door clawed from the inside. Nothing was stolen, nothing burned. The city obeyed a command no one heard but everyone received. The bell does not travel through air, it travels through breath. Witnesses described the same act in street after street. People paused mid-motion, pressed a hand to their chest, and held still as if listening to an instruction only they could hear. They did not run or fight, they complied. Whatever speaks through the concordium never wastes force when consent will do. The keepers of the pause understood sooner than kings or priests. They carried fragments to train the body. They taught brides to close their throats at vows and dying men to swallow their last word. Not faith, conditioning. Think of Harlow's gray-faced wanderers, mouths opening and closing like fish, late by a heartbeat when the toll lived inside their ribs. They stayed because they agreed too slow. They became monuments. Merchants recorded torches frozen and speech unspooled, but missed a child's nail scratch on a courtyard wall. Don't answer when the city calls your name. Children hear the order. Adults hear the promise. What promise? Every 10th bell was tuned not to take but to keep. The bells are containers. They hold what they subtract. 10 cities fill an instrument. When Merrick lowered the Aramore bell into stone, he did not bury a weapon. He locked a crowded room. This is why some bells never age, why chalk refuses their rim, why dust won't cling. Most of their volume lives elsewhere, tugging through breath like a door cracked to a soundless hall. The Concordium forged with debt. Each pore is mixed with owed silence, the speech of 1,000 unborn mouths promised in advance. That is why their founders smile in fire. They have already been paid. And Merrick? He learned burial is not refusal. His die-pressing warning, do not dig, do not toll, was a note to men who think like soldiers. The Concordium thinks like contagion. It needs no shovels, only a listener. A scribe copied a line from the stolen ledger. When the great word is complete, the bells will open, and the kept will step through. The kept, not dead, not damned, stored. The city that vanished after everyone went silent did not vanish. It queued. Consider the hollows spreading. They are not random. They map a sentence. Each zone is a letter in quiet, each toll a stroke, each survivor a comma. When the line joins, what door does it spell? Return to the clawed door. Those scratches were not escape marks, but tallies. Someone inside was counting tolls. Someone inside knew the order and kept pace. Maybe they still are now. That brief hesitation before speech, the small stillness between inhale and word. Who taught you that? Who benefits when you obey? If the Concordium is older than kingdoms and its bells edge a deeper engine, the cycle will not end with broken towers or drowned bronze. It ends when no one answers, and we have practiced for centuries. So ask the only question that matters before the next toll moves the air without moving it at all. When the city calls your name, not with sound but with the feeling that you should go, will you notice you are already walking? Or will you look down at the warm bread in your hands, set it neatly on the table, and decide to be very, very quiet?